She holds a diplôme d'études approfondies from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and a doctorate from the European University Institute. She directs the DEMIS project, where DEMIS stands for Democracy in Europe and the Mobilization of Society, funded by the European Commission, and she coordinates several international research networks on social movements and collective action. She's the author and editor of an astonishing, and I mean astonishing, number of books that have, there is no way that I can list them all. I'm only going to limit myself to those that have been either written in English or translated into English, and still I'm not going to mention them all. So at least, I'd like to mention Social Movements, Political Violence and the State, a comparative analysis of Italy and Germany, published by Cambridge University Press in 1995. Social Movements and Introduction, published by Blackwell in 1999 and co-authored with Marco Diani. Corrupt Exchanges, Actors, Resources, and Mechanisms of Political Corruption, published in 1999 and co-authored with Alberto Vannucci. Globalization from Below, Transnational Activists and Protest Networks, published by Minnesota University Press in 2006. And most recently, one of my favorites, Voices of the Valley, Voices of the Straits, How Protest Creates Community, published last year and co-authored with Gianni Piazza. So as you can see from this list, Donatello della Porta is a social scientist of truly remarkable range and versatility, expert at employing a wide variety of methodologies and versed in the subtleties of many theoretical debates, and yet capable of wonderfully sensitive ethnographic detail as well. I have no hesitation in arguing that she is the most exciting and innovative scholar to be writing on social movements today in Europe, maybe even beyond. So with passion and precision, she has written on political violence and the legacies of 1970s radicalism, on the new movements of the 1980s and 90s, above all the women's movement and the environmental movement, on political corruption and its relationships with market capitalism, and on the global justice movement of the last 10 years since Seattle. So when I started thinking about someone who could deliver a lecture on European integration that could go beyond, right, the official debates and on the policies and institutions of the European Union, as relevant, of course, as those debates are, Donatella's name and work really stood out at the very top of the list. So I'm truly delighted to have her here. I'm sure you will be too after her talk. So please welcome Donatella della Porta to the University of Michigan.
Thank you very much for this touching introduction, and thank you for my first invitation in the University of Michigan, and which I started to like a lot, so I'm sure it will be just the first one of several visits. And I'm going to present today some part of the research project Demos, which Dario introduced, and I hope to speak just for 40 minutes. Please stop me if I am not true to this word. And to discuss especially what I call Europeanizations from below, so the potentials for social movements to become, although critical of Europeanization, to become actors of Europeanization, a bit like the labor movement has been in the past for the development of the nation state. I want to start with two quotes. The first quote is by Pierre Bourdieu, and this says that one can be against a Europe that supports financial markets and at the same time be in favor of a Europe that, through concerted policies, blocks the way to the violence of those markets. So to say that you can be against a certain image of Europe, but to be in favor of another vision of Europe. And another European social scientist, Thomas Wrisse, said that contestation is a crucial precondition for the emergence of a European public spheres rather than an indicator for its absence. So what I want to discuss, developing on the ideas of these two scholars, is first of all the possibilities to perceive criticism of actual European policies, not as a sign of Euroscepticism, but as a sign of the development of a different image of Europe. And second, to discuss how contestation itself can be the engine for the development of what, according to many social and political science, is missing at the European level, that is a European demos, a European identity. So I want to answer two questions today, or at least address them. One is, are social movements and as I'm going to say, one specific social movement which developed in the last decade, carriers of Europeanizations from below. And the second question I want to address is, if so, through which type of mechanism? What produced this type of Europeanizations which was not foreseen in the European treaties or by European Union institutions? And I want to do this by developing two concepts. One is a critical Europeanism, different from Euroskepticism, which is the label which has been mostly used to address criticism of the European Union institutions. And the other one is eventful protest. So a vision of protests as capable of transforming structures and institutions. I want to address these questions and develop these two concepts with reference to a research project, DEMOS, which Dario mentioned, which is a comparative research project on the global justice movement in Italy, France, Germany, the UK, Switzerland, and Spain. And this is a research project to which several colleagues have contributed. Dieter Rucht in Germany, Marco Giugni for Switzerland, Isabelle Sommier for France, Manuel Jimenez for Spain, Dieter Rucht for Germany, Isabelle Sommier for France. And so it is a collective project. The research project, which was sponsored by the European Union, focuses especially on visions of democracy and to which extent social movements, while calling for changes in policies, do produce different visions of democracies and even implement them in a prefigurative way. The research project focused in general on the European part of what has been known as global justice movement, the movement which started in or became visible in Seattle in 1999, and which is composed of a large networks of individuals and organizations that use transnational forms of protest to address claims oriented especially to global justice. The research project in what you can see an eclectic type of methodological approach, a pluralistic type of methodological approach, tried to do this by combining quantitative and qualitative analysis and analysis at the individual level with analysis at the organizational level. So what we have done has been to select about 250 social movement organizations and to investigate their fundamental documents as well as interviewing their representatives. to develop participant observations of some main events and to use at the individual level surveys with activists as well as in-depth interviews with smaller groups of activists, what is usually known as focus groups. The results of this research are to be published in still 3 books. Dario, I'm sorry about that. I promised my husband I will never write a book again. And these are, one is called Social Movements and Europeanization, and is going to be published by Oxford University Press. One addresses especially the organizational level, and is going to be called Democracy in Social Movements and being published by Palgrave, and yet the last one is called Another Europe and uses the surveys and observations of the European social forums. So this also to say that I'm not going to use all this evidence now, but I will refer to some of them, and I may refer to more of them during the discussion. The idea of combining these different type of methodologies came both from our belief that since social movements are made by organizations and individuals, networks of both type of actors, it is important to look at both levels in order to understand the development of these movements. And also the idea was that since social movement organizations are important carriers of visions and practices of democracies, it was important to observe them at different levels, to look at what they do, to look at what they write, and so on. And first of all, this type of evidence I want to use to address the first questions. Critical Europeanism. What do I mean by that? This is a synthesis. Our colleague David Snow would be glad to read it because it indicates that social movements really present themselves according to the main categories that have been used in the sociology of social movements. That is, they use identity frames, oppositional frames, and motivational frames when presenting themselves in the public spheres. And this is a declaration in the 4th of the European Social Forums. I will tell you later on a little bit more about these social forums. For the moment, I can say they are annual meetings of hundreds of organizations and 10,000s of individuals that usually discuss European issues and other visions of Europe, together with another visions of globalization. And what's this, the way in which this movement presents themselves in these documents, which are important because they are considered by the movements themselves as their own identity, the way in which they want to be perceived in the public spheres, singles out the main characteristics of what I called critical Europeanism. First, the movements and the activists present themselves as women and men from social movements across Europe that came to Athens and so on. That is, they present themselves as Europeans, although Europeans of different types, and they present themselves as bridging several types of concerns that have been typical for left libertarian social movements, for old and new social movements. They say to fight against war, neoliberalism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, discrimination, exploitations, and so on. So they present themselves as European activism. And this is interesting and not obvious, since this type of meetings developed on the examples of the World Social Forum, which focused especially on global issues. And Europeanization is not an instance of globalization. I think it's something different. These movements also say we reject this neoliberal Europe and any efforts to relaunch the constitutional treaty. So they describe the diagnosis of what is wrong according to them in Europe, and neoliberalism is a catchword for this. And they present what they are struggling for, and what they say is we are fighting for another Europe. Here as well, Europe which bridges the concerns of the different movements of the past but recent histories. Feminist, ecological, open, peace, social justice, sustainable life, food sovereignty, respect for minorities, and so on. So the vision of another Europe and the type of criticism that activists address to the European Union institutions have been part of our concern. This was, I think, relevant from the perspective of developing studies on Europeanizations, since studies on Europeanizations had been dominated in the very beginning by a neorealist perspective, which considered European Union as international governmental organizations made by states and made of states. So a Europe which had to develop especially top-down, from above. In social movement studies, the development of attention to transnationalizations was a bit difficult also in the beginning, with few exceptions. Jackie Smith, who is among us, Meyersold, and others. Usually social movement studies, as other parts of the social and political sciences, tended to be very deep-rooted in national politics. And social movements were indeed very deep-rooted in national politics. So the first research tended to confirm that social movements tended especially to address national institutions and kept an identity which was mainly nationally oriented. Only slowly, and I think linked to a change in social movement studies and to a change in perspectives in research on Europe, did this type of constraints weaken, so that social movement research started to consider multi-level type of activism, so not to forget the rootedness of many movements at the national or even at the local level, but to consider the interactions of different levels of actions. And in research on Europeanization, the so-called cultural turn has brought in this area of research more attention towards the role of ideas and towards the role of other actors than the states in producing transnational types of phenomenon. This image of European identity, struggle again against a neoliberal Europe and for another Europe, is what we found also at the individual level. I don't know if these are visible. These are the results of 3 surveys with activists at 3 different editions of the European Social Forums for a total of more than 5,000 individuals, which we used together with other type of methods to try to investigate who these activists were and what did they think about different type of social and political problems. one question we asked was the typical questions of trust in institutions. And of course, we can say that these activists, according to the answers they gave to our questionnaires, are critical of the European Union, are mistrustful of the European Union. Only 26% of them, 27% in the first European Social Forum in Florence did trust enough or a lot the European Union. And additionally, this trust declined in time. Down to 14.5% in 2006 at the fourth edition of the European Social Forum. This is true, so that there is a criticism of and mistrust of the European Union. But the other data which are also interesting to combine with that is that the trust in the European Union is not much lower than the trust in other levels of government, of institutions. It is even higher than the trust in national governments, and it is just a bit lower than the trust in the United Nations, which some of these movements believe is the best, if not the good type of transnational institutions. When we asked about the visions of the European Union, the activists confirmed that they believed the European Union didn't do enough to oppose neoliberal globalization and instead tended to strengthen neoliberal globalizations. This data coming from the last survey in Athens indicates some of the concerns of these social movement activists, which addresses the level of decision making, what is usually known in research on Europeanization and the European Union as the democratic deficit of the European Union, the lack of accountability, the lack of politicization of decisions, the weakness of the European Parliament vis-à-vis the executive, the lack or weakness of a public sphere. Also here, what we can see is that activists are very dissatisfied with decision making at the level of the European Union, although they don't think that at the other levels things are working much better. At the national level and in the United Nations, the degree of dissatisfaction is very similar. And finally, when we asked to these activists, what do you think should be done in order to achieve your goals? The strengthening of the European Union got some support, but not a majoritarian type of support, and the support for this solution was declining. Yet here as well, I think it is important to stress the fact that these activists, although critical of the European Union, didn't want to go back or didn't think it was possible to go back to a situation in which the nation states are dominant actors in decision making, but that actual problems require different types of solutions, such as the creation of alternative type of institutions. So in these questions, the strengthening of the national governments got even less support than the strengthening of the European Union as a way of addressing the social and political problems. When we did our participant observations in this forum and in-depth interviews with the activists, as well as the reading of the documents of these organizations, What emerged very clearly and very consistently was the type of criticism that these actors, individuals and organizations addressed to the European Union. I think using terms of political science, one could say that these social movements tend to criticize political, policy and polity type of issues. So they tend to criticize the weakness, one of the accepted weakness, openly proclaimed weaknesses of the European Union, the so-called emphasis on negative integration. Fritz Scharf defined it as such, vis-à-vis the capacity to produce positive integrations through social policies. So they criticized very in-depth the type of policies that the European Union developed with the priority given to the liberalizations of the market vis-à-vis the development of social citizenship. A second level of criticism, we can say, addresses the polity, the understanding of who is inside and who is outside. The criticism of European as a fortress criticized the very definitions of the borders of the European Union and the definitions of citizenships and citizenships rights that's economic globalization as well as the development of the European Union itself tend to challenge. And they this is an issue very much debated by these actors, how to produce, how to construct a Europe which is inclusive in terms of recognitions of citizenship, instead of a European Union that constructs itself against the others. And in this case, the other is often the other inside, because it is the large and growing number of migrants that in Europe enjoy little social, political, and civil rights. Other level is at the political level. A very widespread criticism is that the Europe which has been constructed until now tend to be a Europe of the elite, either in terms of expertise, the Eurocrats, or in terms of a political elite which is little accountable to the people. So these are criticisms which often brought about a vision and image of this type of movements as Eurosceptic, especially after the defeat of the constitutional treaty in the French referendum. Organizations coming from this area of the social movements were declared as responsible for this type of defeat, since organizations like ATTAC, they had criticized the European Treaty and asked to vote against it. My image of critical Europeanist takes instead into account the other part of each of these statements, that is that together with an against a certain type of Europe, there is a for another type of Europe, for a social Europe, for a Europe of freedoms, and for a Europe from below. And this was clear in several statements by the organizations during the debates we observed, by the activists we interviewed. To cite just a few of these quotes. One activist says, the European Union, for the European Union, Europe is only a large free exchange area. We want a Europe based upon democracy, citizenship, equality, peace, job, and a revenue to life. Another Europe for another world. Another organization says to build another Europe imposes to put the democratic transformations of institutions at the center of our mobilization. Another activist said the European Social Forum constitutes the people as a constitutional power and act as in order to construct a European identity. Still another activist said there is a real desire of Europe, but not of any type of Europe. So the image which emerged is an image of strong criticism and mistrust, but at the same time also of the formation of a demand for Europe, which is also testified for in the survey by a large number of activists who declare themselves as strongly identified with Europe, not with the European Union or Europe with capital E and U, but with a European element. To the second part of my presentation, which is in part inspired by the Michigan School of Social Movements that always put a lot of emphasis on mobilization. Stressing the importance of collecting, mobilizing resources. In this research, though, I sort of looked at the problem of mobilizations of resources also from the other point of view. Are social movements able in action to produce type of resources? And here I developed upon a concept which historian William Sewell has developed. He talked of eventful temporality, pointing at the fact that there are in history some events that have the capacity to change structures. It was mainly addressing the debate among historians that Dario knows much better than me, and trying to rebalance the attention to the longue durée, recognizing its importance, but also stressing the role of agencies. And he stressed the fact that there are events as a relatively rare subclass of happenings that significantly transform structures. Other social movement scholars like Doug McAdam developed conceptions of transformative events to refer to those events which remain impressed in the memories of all the activists. Turning points, like the taking of the Bastille for the French revolutions, or the Montgomery bus boycott for the civil rights movement in this country and in the world. I thought these concepts were relevant, but I thought that it tended to focus attentions only to too small a class of event. And with the conceptions of eventful protest, I wanted to stress the role and importance of these transnational protest events, which, true, when counted, were few in numbers and were outnumbered by a local and national type of protests, but which I think were particularly eventful in terms of their capacity to construct this type of critical Europeanism that I have observed in the descriptive part of these presentations. So what I wanted to look at was the capacity of these types of events, which usually imply long-lasting process of organizations, of mobilizations, of planning, and so on, to introduce changes in the organizational side to facilitate, produce, induce networking, to develop, to have cognitive type of effect, changing in the process the visions of the actors of themselves and the external realities, and to produce also affective changes among the individual actors. So relational, cognitive, and affective mechanism would be the term which Tarot and Tilly and McAdam would use in their dynamic visions. So even though recognizing that a lot of resources are invested in these types of events, I wanted to look also at the capacity of these events to produce resources for collective action. And we have reconstructed and looked at especially two types of transnational protests, or types of protests. One is the so-called Countersummits, and the other one is the European Social Forums. Countersummits is an invention of the new wave of protest which developed since Seattle in 1999. In Seattle, the protest against the Millennium Round of the World Trade Organizations was a counter summit, in the sense that it tended to protest in different forms against official meetings of international governmental organizations by squatting in a way the attention that usually focuses sporadically on this type of events. And if you look at this slide, what you see are names which usually in institutional analysis of the process of development of the European Union institutions are considered as typically milestones for the development of the competencies and the geographical range of coverage of the European Union. Amsterdam, Nice, Copenhagen, and so on. All these events, which often represent or are remembered because of treaties which have played an important role in the official histories of Europeanization top-down, are, however, also important events for the development of those visions of critical Europeanism which I have presented before. And I think that an in-depth analysis of these events, which I cannot do now, but I want to summarize very briefly, indicates how in the course of the organizations of these events, the development of these events, and the shift from one to the next, so the evolution of this history, is characterized by the development of these processes of relational, cognitive, and affective mechanism. Very briefly, 1997 is Amsterdam. Two French organizations had organized the first European March Against Unemployment. And activists from these movements, which is a typical poor people movement in Piven and Cloward definition, so those movements which are usually very difficult to mobilize, not only mobilized but also went to Amsterdam, mainly from France and Germany, but also from all the other European countries. And 50,000 people protested. In Nice, this process had evolved 3 years later. The people were more numerous, but especially the number of organizations that participated in these mobilizations increased, and the attention shift from the issues of unemployment to broader type of issues. And all the other events, Gothenburg in 2001, when 3 demonstrators were wounded by the Swedish police, symbolically indicating also the degree of politizations and conflict that had developed around European issues and the construction of the European unions. And then Barcelona with 300 people mobilizing against the Europe of Capital for another Europe, Seville, Copenhagen, are all examples of this process in which these three different types of resources were constructed. So relational, from the two organizations very much also boycotted by the larger unions, including the European Trade Union confederations. We shift to a much broader network of organizations, up to a few hundreds, which included the European Trade Union confederations, included NGOs, included religious type of organizations, included squatters, formal and informal social movement organizations. So included different types of groups active in different and all European and even some non-European countries, and also included organizations which were active on different aspects of European problems. Women's groups, ecological groups, unions, and other type, youth organizations, and so on. This process, which was initially defined as instrumental, in the beginning the main point was let's collect our strength against a common enemy, even if we are diverse and even if we are heterogeneous, brought about the process of cognitive construction of a self. And this self tended to be European because the different actors that participated in these networks tended to share their own experiences, their own visions, their own differences, but also the attempt to solve or at least combine these differences into something which could enrich the movements. So it was through the exchanges which had started in a very pragmatic and instrumental way that this type of cognitive process developed. In also affective ties developed in this process. The marches were often long ones in which activists participated for days to this type of demonstrations. And in their own accounts, during these demonstrations, meeting people from different countries, also personal friendships developed. And last 5 minutes maybe, I shift to another illustrations which can be perceived also as a continuum. Countersummits were organized as protest events against meeting of the European Union, but they usually involved also a more constructive side, and part of this constructive side developed into European social forums, which are meetings which have been organized 5 times from 2002, the first one in Florence, to 2000 last year, the last one in Malmo, so also geographically including spaces, places which represent the all different areas of Europe, from Italy, France, and the UK to Greece, and the south, and Malmo, the north. And this type of meetings usually lasted a bit less than a week, and were organized into several different open spaces for activists to meet and exchange ideas about the Europe they didn't want and the Europe they wanted. With the participation of an astonishing numbers of organizations, up to almost 1,000 groups coming from all Europe, of activists, and the participation of free-willing interpreters that try to address the specific problems of building of an open space or a public sphere in a multilinguistic type of context. Also, at this level of the social forums, our research seems to indicate that relational, cognitive, and affective type of mechanism were at play, and that this produced the construction of linkages between organizations and the larger and larger networks of organizations, which often developed also during the phases of preparations of this meeting, which lasted from one meeting to the next, with the development of European preparatory assemblies where activists met to address the different political and organizational process of the events. Especially, I think these European social forums played a particularly relevant cognitive role in as far as Europe was at the center of all the discussion. As I mentioned, the Europe they didn't want and the Europe they did want. And the debate tended to be very informed, with a lot of emphasis on the specific knowledge these different types of organizations could bring about, and the development of different types of platforms about demands to the European Union. Affective ties developed as well, in part among the cosmopolitan leadership or the elite, which tended to play a role in the organizations of these groups, but very often also at the level of the activists. Activists are hosted in private houses usually, so they tend to meet other activists from other places. They live in camps, so they tend to exchange experiences and so on. So conclusions. I think that this type of critique of Europe is very different from the Euroskepticism, which usually implies a demand for less Europe. These activists tend to demand more Europe, but more Europe of another type. For sure, they indicate that the traditional legitimation formulas that the European Union has invented, like recognitions of the legitimacy of the output, as Fritz Scharf put it, that is an attempt to be recognized as a regulatory, benignant type of organizations that doesn't take political decisions, but just implement and facilitate the well-being of all the members, is no longer tenable. All these steps in the development of the European Union have meant growing competencies in areas which are political and politically contested. Maastricht with the Maastricht parameters, Nice with the certain type of definitions of citizenship rights, are all signs of growing institutions which is making political decisions. And so political decisions brings about criticism, or as Thomas Risser mentioned, a contestation. A contestation, though, that I think is not a sign of the weaknesses of the process, but more a sign of a spreading of the process to different levels. So in a way, the criticism of this Europe have produced in action an image of another Europe. To a certain extent, I think this type of process is similar to the process which developed at the nation states and which brought about some conceptions of citizenship and citizens' rights. Also at the nation states, the labor movement in Europe had challenged a vision of the states, had criticized a capitalist state, but at the same time had organized at the national level, developed visions of alternative national systems, and in a way, looking at Charles Tilly's work, legitimized national institutions by contesting them. And it had created networks of individuals and organizations that tended to meet, discuss, and create alternative visions. So as most of the historical sociologists and the historians of the past has indicated, the development of the nation states and the development of citizenship rights has been the product of conflicts, of the mobilizations of actors that have challenged the existing reality. I think that also at this level, at the European level, even without taking too far a parallel which is somehow difficult to sustain between the nation state and this strange beast of the European Union. But I think that also in this case, what we observe is the fact that the conflicts that are developing at the European level are not so much conflict between center and periphery, but are more similar to the class conflict of the past, to use a traditional old term. That is, they're more addressing social issues than the legitimacy of building different level of governance. And this is so because these actors, which includes old and new social movements, tend to propose an image of a community or a territory which is based on recognitions of certain rights and construction of common identities. So as Bourdieu said, they are actors that tend to recognize the need for a political supranational type of intervention on the market, even though they want to have a word and a say in how this political decision is made. Thank you.
So, do you want to field your own questions, or yeah? So we have time for some questions.
Yes.
That was very interesting and important work you're doing. Have you been able to assess the effect of these movements on actual decision-making at the European Union governance? I'm sorry, have you been able to assess the effects of this activism at the level of decision-making of the European Union and its governance?
We are starting some research more focusing on the effects, which also mean taking into account not only this part of the activities of social movements, but also the part more lobby-oriented or oriented towards interventions of different levels. What we found in particular in the quantitative part is that many of these actors, the organizations and the individuals, are very pragmatic in their use of very different forms of intervention. We have studied, in particular, I have two PhD students who are focusing on some campaigns, comparing the capacities of civil society actors to change decisions such as the Bolkestein Directive or decisions on coexistence on the genetically modified food and so on. And what it emerges is that indeed, European institutions are difficult to address because of the weakness of some of the mechanism of democratic accountability, which tend to protect them from public scrutiny. And at the same time, that's the rhetoric which has been used very often in recent times by the European Union of being open to civil society actors and of wanting to govern with the people, especially after the white paper on governance, didn't really reflect a reality in which still strong interests are much better represented. But nevertheless, in some cases, social movements have been able to intervene in some of these decisions, changing the policies. The Bolkestein Directive is one of these cases. When they have, their success has been related with their capacity to act at different levels. So to intervene on the different types of opportunity structures which different European Union institutions opened. So to make pressure on the European Council requires very different types of organizational resources and strategies than to make pressure on the European Parliament or on the commissions or using the European courts. So it seems that, to me, that these movements are more and more skilled in trying to develop multi-strategy and multi-level type of intervention. Still, the European Union level is a difficult one to address. Also, the preparation of these demonstrations, although they are very relevant in terms of their capacity to form social movements, are still weak in terms of their capacity to address a system of governance which is much less transparent and accountable than at other levels.
By the answer you get in your interviews about which confirms me to a certain extent that this organization maybe sometimes don't know what the European Union is doing, and for instance what the constitutional treaty was about, because for instance you said well, they are against a neoliberal Europe, but probably these are the same people flying to Lund, to Florence, using a Ryanair cheap fly, which is the result of the liberalization process of the building of an internal market in Europe. They are against the constitution, but for human rights, without knowing that in the constitution there was the Charter of Nice was introduced. There was a clause for adhering to the European Convention of Human Rights. They want food sovereignty, but they don't know that the common agricultural policy, as it has been carried out until now, is strangling farmers in developing countries while making fatter and fatter.
I don't think they would agree with this.
I know, but
and probably it is contested to it.
Well, yeah, it's certainly contested, but the problem is that sometimes, I mean, in the debate, lack of knowledge of what the European does and can do, actually, because asking for the European Union to provide jobs or to deal with the social security system, I mean, it's outside the competence of the European Union. I mean, it's a bit, so my problem with this, I mean, my discomfort from this answer is that, I mean, this Europeanization from below is a good thing as long as, I mean, there is an understanding of what the European Union can do, what it had done in the past, and what can do in the future. But I mean, it's a matter of more communication, probably from the European Union, to be able to, make the society know what they can do and what they have done until now, and what they can do with the instruments they have. So rather than.
Well, I think there would be the need for other conferences on all these issues, because the effect of the European Union decisions on genetically modified food, food sovereignty, and all the levels you have mentioned are contested, in the sense there is a lot of use of knowledge in these meetings, for sure. Of course, it is a visions which can be opposed to yours, appreciation, which is also something which can be contested. But especially I wanted to address one of the issues which you mentioned. You say you cannot ask more social interventions to the European Union, and this is a main problem at the moment, because in part from in the debates on the cuts in the European welfare states, Maastricht parameters have been used, or you can say misused, as the reasons for these cuts. So it means with its growing competencies on monetary policies, the European Union is having an effect in terms of social policies. Since most of the decision making on social policies at the European level is influenced by decisions by the European Union, this type of distinction doesn't work any longer. And to a certain extent, there is a book by a colleague of mine, Stefano Bartolini, who used Steinrocken in order to try to address the strengths and weaknesses of the European Union. What he stresses is that also at the national level, social competencies were not there since the very beginning, but they developed because in the construction of boundaries, you need to intervene by building identities, and this means also by recognizing rights. And the European Union could rely upon these sort of divisions of labors, the economic and monetary issues addressed by the European Union, and the social issues by the nation states, until when monetary competencies and in general the competencies of the European Union were more reduced. Now, since it is in also in the perspective of the constitutional treaty to go much beyond regulatory forms of Europe, demands for social rights come naturally, you can say, in the sense following a path which developed also at the European Union. Scholars in the tradition of the neoliberal or neorealist, sorry, or more regulatory type of approach to the European Union, like Andrea Moravcic, have stressed the fact that it was a mistake by the European Union to want to increase its legitimacy by developing a European treaty, and that it should have remained with lower and uncontested competencies. My impression is that also at this level it was unavoidable in the development of this type of institutions that they would increase their competencies, and that this would increase the politicization.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about there was a finding in your book, Globalization from Below, on the effects of these movements on political parties within countries. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the effects of these European movements on political parties, but other national institutions. Are they helping to transform the state in ways that might be significant?
I think these movements, as other in the past, have been at the same time causes and consequences of some shift in the main attitudes. And in Europe, this call for intervention, social state, the state against the market, and so on, is developed, prompted by this type of mobilizations, but also in a broader way, also in other type of political actors. And political parties are some of them. So political parties have participated in the European social forums, and in other contestations of European Union policies. For sure, the trade unions are now much more careful in what they demand and what they accept at the level of the European Union. But the relationship between parties and social movements, I think, in Europe are more, at the same time, more and more difficult, because these movements also changed a lot the type of structural organizational model. And in the interactions with the political parties, they tend to present very different visions of what not only Europe is, but also about what politics is. And while the political parties tended to develop more towards what in political science has been defined as cartel parties, electoral parties, so with less and less of a capacity to bridge the society with the state or to act as brokers, social movements developed more and more critical also of political parties. And so it is a difficult type of relations. At the World Social Forum, even with a lot of difficulties, tended to reject the participations of political parties, while in Europe, the European Social Forum has stressed the differences at the European level in the relationship between parties and social movements. But I think they tend to be more and more tense. In Europe in the 70s, the relationship were much more tight, and in the 60s even more. Now they tend to develop apart.
Hi, so this is a very interesting research project you have going, very ambitious, and I'm amazed by how much data you marshaled. But I just have a question in terms of Europe from below and versus like this dichotomy between a Europe from below versus a Europe of elites. And as we looked at these individuals and their beliefs, they seem very cosmopolitan, a belief in even to the extent that they believe in an international system of governance. And so the question becomes, who are these people, and are they just another set of elites that just happen to hold a different view of the best way to distribute goods and the ideal form of governance?
Yes, this is a very relevant question, and there things of the Ryanair elite has been discussed also inside these social movements that have also in some cases been criticized from within, and there have been the development of alternative spaces near to the European social forums, but also there have been attempt to reform this. There is a transnational organization called Novox that has developed to put forward this type of complaints by the excluded, which meant very often also in Europe, Eastern Europeans that have had much less money for traveling and for hosting this type of meetings. In part, and in some countries, some larger organizations have helped to reduce these inequalities by offering grants. But the problem is still open. What we saw participating in these events was that there is for sure a cosmopolitan elite, which is not made by the leaders of the large organizations that participate in this meeting, but more by people that who became specialized in transnational activities for the unions or for large NGOs, and that started to talk a lot with each other and to develop this common type of identities. This very often was also criticized from inside because it was reflected in the plenary sessions, which were very large sessions, where this cosmopolitan elite was visible also sometimes in the structure of the presentation, like me on this side and the others on the other side. But I think that one of the reasons for the continuity of the process is that the plenary sessions have been abolished on the basis of this criticism, but also that I think what attracts more the activists are the smaller workshops, in which you often found, also with another type of settings, more sitting around in smaller rooms and so on, really local activists. We observed some of these from the beginning to the end, and it often includes the exchange of telephone numbers and the participations of still a lot of very young people. And in this case, rank and file. In fact, I think that what it produced from this type of larger meetings is very often smaller networks active at the local or linking groups active at the local level. To give you an example, there was one of these on local type of housing problems at the local level, and there you found about 10 speakers from a squatting place in Amsterdam, one in Helsinki, a voluntary association intervening in Barcelona. So a lot of small groups, and so also activist, say rank and file activists. And so there is the problem you mentioned, and it is criticized from inside of the building of cosmopolitan elites of another type. But I think there is also other type of networking going on.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you so much for one.
Thank you very much.